Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the Panacea Society and all for sponsoring this. It's been a wonderful day so far. The main reason I'm here is really to remind you that Queen's University Belfast is in Northern Ireland and that they're Northern Ireland people, because the only Queen's University people you've heard so far are all from North America. And just in case you get this idea that Northern Ireland is sort of like a weird North American penal colony or something like that, you know, we still don't forget 1776, but there we go. I'm coming at this from the point of view of an old-fashioned empirical historian who works on mainstream Protestantism. And so the comments I'm going to be making are my general reflections upon things that I've heard today. Things to do with definitions, things to do with tensions, paradoxes, contradictions that I've sort of detected as we've gone through. In terms of the first set of ideas associated with definitions of gender, of women, of men, and of potential other ways of thinking about those issues, I think there's a number of things that I think I've thought about. In terms of women, there's a very clear sense that we're dealing here with paradoxes or dualisms, the now and the not yet, the purity and sinfulness, end versus the beginning, as we're also thinking about. There's these different sets of natural versus supernatural is another one, of course, as well. And we're trying to think about those in terms of complicating the experience of women in particular. I've also detected, particularly in areas which I'm less familiar with, tensions in terms of reconciling spiritual experience with authoritative interpretations of texts, with church structures, with patriarchal assumptions and social and economic and class norms in general. Class is something which I think is bubbling at certain points in the discussion. Also the issue of age, young women versus middle-aged women versus old women. And I suppose all these things are sort of coming to my to focus in terms of this place. And one of the comments I made when I came here was, this is very English. It's a very English setup here. It's also a very middle class setup. It's also a very feminine setup. And that has interesting ways of interpreting how we think about even this society and the tradition that's been talked about here. And I just wonder, in terms of thinking about specific contexts, specific places, if you like, to get geographical about it. There we go. Just try to make you feel at home. What is the geographer doing here? He's lost his way. And we laughed. Anyway. It's okay, I do weddings and bar mitzvahs as well, so I'm available for hire. So there are those general sort of issues we're thinking about there in terms of women. But yet I'm struck by the fact that only 5% of Millerite preachers were women. I'm struck by the fact that only 22% of those thousands of new religious groups we've been thinking about, and specifically those that have a millennial emphasis, are led or founded by women. And I suppose the other thing is men. And men, generally speaking, in this conversation have been the other, rather than necessarily the focus of attention. And I certainly know from history, gender tends to be about women. Masculinity as a concept is something which has only relatively recently been introduced into the historical literature. So I'm wondering about the other side. I'm wondering about the other, that is the male. How stable is that concept when we think about these things? This is brought to mind whenever Joe was giving his talk, and he was talking about how males dress. There's no real gender aspect to that from the point of view of, and if you just look at all the men in this room, we all vaguely dress the same colours and things like that. I just wondered if any of these Scottish men that were slagging these women off for wearing trousers, did any of them wear kilts? Well, that's unfortunate because that would have been really good. Thank you. Good. I'm glad you caught up eventually. But maleness. How do we think about that? If we think about, for instance, even the book of Daniel, there are almost two Daniels in that book. The first half is confident, young, a mouthpiece of the Lord. The second half talks about his vulnerability. It talks about the fact that he has to rely on somebody else to get him through these things. That's a sign of masculinity that we don't really get here. I think about that in terms of the three Anglican clergymen that lived on this site. I think about, is it John Rasmussen? Is that correct? Peter, sorry, I apologize. That's my son's name. My goodness, that's a bad job. I forgot that. Why did these men invest so much in female authority figures? The deluded followers of Joanna Southcott, as E.P. Thompson famously talked about. Why on earth did they support that? So I think we need to maybe think a wee bit more about maleness as such, about those men that actually were involved in these things. And we also have to think about the fact that whenever women are actually admitted into places of power and authority, if you like, in Christian denominations at least, it has to be because men in some ways let them. So we need to think about that side to some degree as well. I also am thinking about the issue of egalitarianism, the issue about non-gender. The very helpful comment that was made earlier on about transgender and issues like that. How does that fit into this? How does this fit into this in terms of the revival of the X-Files? Which is a very sort of millennial way of thinking about the world. That the only way salvation is going to happen is if there's some kind of interaction with aliens. And I was just thinking about this. Are aliens gendered? That's potentially interesting. Radiohead, one of the great sort of bands of the 1990s, the only way you could get any kind of redemption in their songs was actually going along a road and getting taken up into a UFO. I just wonder, that is millennialism. It's not maybe what Joanna Southcott or other people would recognise, but there is something there about a non-gender or a third gender or a fourth or whatever it might be way of thinking about things. I also thought about children in this concept as well. And I just thought of the point, at what point does a child become a girl or a boy? There are, I think, interesting things that we need to think about there. And those set of comments about how we define particular groups that we're thinking about then led me to think about relationships, sexual issues, reproduction, fertility, and issues like that, which came out, I think, quite a bit. We can think about sex being about polluting, about being nasty, about being sinful, but it also, reproduction and sexuality also talk about fertility and potential promise, Shiloh, Messiah, ways of regenerating. I was also very struck by flirty fishing, I must admit. That was really interesting, a complete sort of, well, it's a reflection of, I suppose, the sexual revolution in the 1960s and things like that, but that's interesting in comparison with celibacy. We have to think about how marriage might work in this particular context. How are gender roles seen in terms of marriage? In terms of Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, earthly marriage isn't just an earthly thing, it's also got significance in terms of the eternal, in terms of the afterlife. So there are issues, I think, around sort of relationships, about sexual relationships, about reproduction, fertility, which I think might be worth thinking about as well. But I suppose being an empirical historian and thinking about these issues, ideas, theories, oh dear. Theology, philosophy, goodness me, that's all, tell me the facts, give me the facts. And I suppose the issue I wanted to raise, just to finish what I wanted to say here, is does millennialism actually make a difference in terms of thinking about gender? Because in many ways I think the force of a lot of what has been said today is that it maybe actually doesn't. And that it might feed into a broader sociological phenomenon, which I think was Weber, about the routinization of charisma. That there's something about the initial sort of chaos, if you like, of new religious movements that put gender roles at a discount. But after a while, the systems come into place, patriarchy reasserts itself and things like that. And I just wonder, is millennialism just part of a broader sociological thing we could talk about, or does it add different things to it? So those are my general comments. I'm very conscious that there were papers today where we couldn't ask questions. So at this point, does anybody have any sort of like general comments they want to make, or any specific comments about any of the papers that we heard?
I can offer my 2 bits about the apocalypse. Not about. I think your comments were great, but they were gender heavy. I find, and if we're going to think about the theme of the apocalypse also, which kind of unites us here as well, then my 2 comments are firstly about concept. I find that my material lends itself to a theological notion of the apocalypse, while most of the papers I heard seem to be more anthropocentric views of the apocalypse, where humanity ends, time ends. And about the nature of time itself, we need to think a bit more critically about what does it mean to be in human time and post, time which is not anthropocentric. And the second comment was about the nature of our materials. Of course, I was working with poems, and my other presenter who was working with prophetic speech was types of material that lend themselves to particular type of resonance in apocalyptic movements. And it's about the nature of material as well, if we can think about what are the kind of ways in which the communication happens about apocalyptic ideas, and why do certain forms are privileged over others. A philosophical tract might not work as an apocalyptic material rather than a poem or a prophetic speech act.
I think that's a very good point, because the other issue I was thinking about was visual. Yeah, and images and clothing as well, and issues like that, which I think was a theme which ran through a number of papers too. No, I do take your point about the issue of actually thinking about what time is in this context. Most of my students in my lectures say time drags. What on earth does that mean? I take it personally, of course.
I'm just saying, because you mentioned children here, which we haven't talked about. This is just, I'm one of the trustees of the Panacea, as well as being an academic in study of religion. Just something interesting when you're looking around the museum, the Jesuelites, one part of the story, made a big thing of having children preachers, and children would memorise the fiery flying roll, their sacred texts, as it were. And this was kind of rather important in their identity, and from the outside it was a rather notable thing. There's certain element of showmanship about most of the traditions associated one way or another with the Panacea Society and many apocalyptic groups. This was the demonstrating their difference and their specialness and getting the punters in. But I think there is something interesting in this particular prophetic tradition about the place of children and the Jesuelites is worthy of study.
Was it girls and boys?
Yes, girls and boys.
Girls and boys,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the masculinity, because gender, working originally in biblical studies, you'd always get books on gender, and there would always be about women. There was hardly ever a mention of men until relatively recently, so the last sort of 7 or 8 years that you start finding books about masculinity. But I suppose a few things struck me, again, in relation to, for example, Ireland, say in the 1650s, you get the radically eschatological movement like the Quakers, where you get someone like John Perrott, who's an Irish Quaker who referred to himself as a woman in a lot of his apocalyptic writings. So there are some interesting things to look at there, and even thinking about the UFO cults that you were mentioning, cults wrong word, new religious movements. I think you were saying about Heaven's Gate and the practice of castration and all these sort of things. That there's clearly an awful lot of mileage in these questions about what sort of gender was being created. And also it strikes me in relation to these movements of the differential between different sorts of masculinity. To think of something like the Branch Davidians and the functional castration or emasculation of the men in that movement, apart from Koresh himself. So rather, I think there's a lot that we can make. So thank you for drawing attention to this huge lacuna, the absence of discussion of men when we're talking about gender.
I know, because we assume that in traditional scholarship it's all about men, and of course it is all about men. Say political history or ecclesiastical history, or whatever it might be. But the concept has never actually been talked about. Like, how is the idea of a man being constructed here? What are the ideas and things? For instance, in terms of the Book of Revelation, I think it's only fairly recently that people have started to look at masculinity, and wouldn't that be? Wouldn't be right?
Yeah. So hypermasculinity.
Yeah.
The hypermasculinity. So, yeah.
Thank you also for bringing up the conversation of relationships and eschatological thinking. I've been thinking a lot about that recently, and the whole idea of going from the kind of Pauline comment that, if you have to get married, if you can't not have sex, then get married. It's better to do that than burn, but otherwise just don't get married. To kind of the early house churches having their, well, Jesus is going to come back, so we won't get married, and marriage just being totally de-emphasised. To sit, especially in my own movement now, thinking about Steve's talk, almost all of those women are married, and there is a consistent talk of under the covering of my husband. I'm not sure what happened over the generations there, that it's, the talk of the relationship between eschatological thinking and marriage and relationships is really interesting. I think someone should do a PhD on it if they haven't already. Next one.
I think just to throw a Northern Irish accent, but who lives in Hertfordshire, so it's a Northern Irish accent. Just, I'm a non-academic, just interested in all sorts of groups. But notable in these three women, what we haven't said is Ellen White is from a black background. Most people don't appreciate that Ellen White, so there's not just a woman, there's a black woman. Also, Mary Becker Eddy on the third, the founder of Christian Science. Interesting that when she instituted the kind of pastorship, she instituted the Bible and science and health as the pastors, in a sense saying there would not be male or female, but the pastor would be the books. I think the other person that comes to mind in this conversation is Mary Lee, who was the founder of the Shakers, who lived in Manchester but went to America. And the Shaker movement was celibacy. I think actually this movement, the Panacea movement, was celibacy really. So there's an interesting thing there about perhaps then women, sex, and was there some sense of freedom by being celibate. So I'm just kind of throwing, and also just to bring the Northern Ireland aspect, the person who came through my mind was Amy Carmichael. And how she as a Presbyterian went to India and created an order of women that still exists in India. So those are just some of the things that go through my head.
No, Carmichael's a fascinating because she basically set up this community associated with trying to get young girls out of prostitution. Isn't that right? Trying to rescue temple prostitutes. Yeah, temple prostitutes. That's right. But also, she completely infuriated the sort of leadership of mainstream missions in India, and there was a "Get Amy Out of India" campaign launched because she is remarkable, but she, I think, well illustrates that tension between, on the one hand, authoritative interpretations of certain passages of scripture come from a very traditional Presbyterian background, but at the same time finding some kind of liberation, some kind of freedom in a particular context, and with a very clear sense of what calling she's been called to. Absolutely. The issue of race is also another thing which is, I think, interesting, and it was I was very struck. Is it William Seymour? Yeah. A black man who was leading this.
I missed out a bit of that paragraph, but it's really interesting looking at the life of him under Parnham. He, and I wrote something recently on the kind of if I have a lot of friends who are in the Black Lives Matter movement, and the connections that there are there. He was made to sit outside of Parnham's classroom and listen through a cracked open door, and that's how he learned all his theology. When it was not raining, when it was raining, he was outside. And it was an amazing kind of story, because he didn't really react in anger. He just said, I'm going to take all this and see what happens with it. And then it was not only a black man, but it was a Hispanic woman who was by his side. So it was two racial minorities that it was birthed under. So it was really interesting in terms of, and Parnham never, he continually still sought out Parnham, but he never accepted the mixing of races within the movement. So it is very, and now it's of course huge within the Black Church as well. Sorry, just talk about Seymour and Jean Vanier all day. So
Okay, right, we'll move away.
Guys, I think we are probably going to draw it to a close there, unless anyone has a final urgent question. So my thank you to Andrew for some really fantastic discussing comments, and to everyone who's presented today.